So I want to ask, what, and give me kind of your first thought. What word or phrase comes to mind when you think of deserts, as in the place? What is
Sand.
sand?
Lack of water.
Still.
Empty.
Dry air.
Barren.
Silence.
Hot.
Peaceful.
Vest.
Stars and cactuses.
Hmm. Norman in the comments typed calm. Thank you all for those comments. Quite a few. Some of them were barren, some were dry, some were vast, calm, quiet, silent. Did you all know that the Southwest deserts in the United States are the most species-rich ecosystem in the entire country? And did you know that deserts are the most dynamic ecosystem on the planet, second only to tropical forests in their diversity of species? When I was watching One Planet recently, I heard that, and that just blew my mind, because when we think of deserts, there's often this sense of desolateness, barrenness, silence, stillness. But let me just say that again. They are the most dynamic ecosystem on the planet, second only to tropical forests and their diversity of species. Today's sermon, I want to talk about perspective, because what you see isn't always what you see at first glimpse isn't always kind of what is going on, much like deserts. The first Easter, I want to put in perspective. The first Easter happened when people were locked at home, hunkered down, nobody was at synagogue. Sound familiar? Sound a little something we've gotten, I don't want to say used to, but that was when the first Easter happened. And happened in circumstances much like our own. Last week we heard about Mary, who went to the tomb to, pay tribute and to attend to Jesus's body, and she found that the tomb was empty, and she went and she told, and Peter and John came because they didn't believe her at first. And then after they came to the tomb and found it empty, the scripture last week said they still didn't really understand that Jesus was to rise from the dead, and they returned home. So we have again this return home. Anyone getting comfortable with their home in this time? Then we have Mary, who didn't return home. She hung around that garden we heard last week, and she encountered Jesus. That was the first resurrection encounter in a garden. And today's scripture reading that we heard immediately follows that scripture. It ended with verse 18 last week. Verse 19 started this week. Today's encounter, again, they're back in a room, hunkered down, doors are locked. Interestingly, though, they were told by Mary last week that she had seen Jesus. So they're not really living into that Jesus is risen quite yet. They're locked, they're in fear. It wasn't until this encounter with the risen Jesus in today's gospel that they really embraced and lived into the wonder of the resurrection. But here's the thing, I don't want to talk about this whole encounter in today's gospel lesson. I actually want to talk about I'm going to use the word, Jean, that liminal space between last Sunday's reading and today's encounter with Jesus. Jesus had resurrected. Mary Magdalene knew it. She had this encounter in the garden. Jesus hasn't yet come to their locked room, this little in-between space. In that in-between space, the resurrection has happened. The resurrection is true. Jesus is alive and well. The power of God has overcome death. What hasn't happened yet is that shift in their perspective, that truly taking that belief to heart and that changing how they live and act and move and have their being. But even in the midst of this gloomy, fearful place that they are in, locked away, hunkered down in that room, in that gloom before this encounter with Jesus, God was alive. God was walking in the midst of humanity and Christ risen. The resurrection happened while everyone's hunkered down, locked doors, at home. Things felt gloomy. And for us, I imagine this time that we're locked down, hunkered down, at home, resurrection happened with Easter last week. I think it's probably easy for some of us to feel a little gloomy, missing some of the things that we are used to. Frustration, I think, abounds. I see that in some of the drivers on the street. We hear good news, much like Mary brought good news to the disciples, and then sometimes we doubt that good news. In the midst of all of this, there is resurrection now. It's about perspective. It's like the desert. Faith is knowing that the reality of the resurrection is, even though things might not seem like it. There is essentially in today's gospel reading a new beatitude. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who believe and have not seen." That gets me thinking about what belief is, because for the disciples, there was this shift where they then believed what Mary shared after Jesus appeared and they could see the wounds and all of that. But I think it's something more based on this new beatitude Jesus offers. Blessed are those who believe and have not seen. I don't think it's seen, but I think it's a disposition of perspective of looking, expecting that God is at work, even when it might not even seem like it. Belief then is kind of a trust that God is being God, that God's love and force is at work. It's that desert. It might look gloom and barren, desolate. The world around us might feel like that sometimes, but faith says that even in the midst of that, God is at work in ways that we have to look closely, that we have to open our perspective to see. There was a favorite parable of my grandmother, my mom's mom, Winifred. It went like this, that two men looked out from prison bars. One saw mud and one saw stars. There are always stars. There's always mud, there's always resurrection, there's always suffering. The fact is that in the midst of it all, there is God at work, especially when things seem grim, especially when there is suffering. We see that in Jesus's life. He was like a magnet to those places where there was need. I want to invite you all right now to share, again, unmuting yourself one at a time as you feel moved. In the midst of it all, resurrection has happened. So I want to know, where have you seen resurrection? Where have you seen the flowers in the desert? Where have you seen God at work in this Eastertide so far, this past week? Miracles are happening all around us. God's force is at work every day. Where have you seen it?
in the outpouring of help for our feeding programs.
I've seen it just in taking walks, neighbors that I don't know as we walk, waving, saying hello, you know, at asking how we're doing, people we don't even know.
I've seen it in people focusing on what they're called to do as opposed to what they may have been doing before they were forced to stop and think and listen.
I've seen it in Jack's recovery. After a very serious hospital stay, he's now doing better. That's my resurrection.
Mm.
I've seen it in a lightening of my grief. I just last night dreamed that Jeff and I were staying or living or had moved into a house, and going in and out the doors and looking at the neighborhood, we realized it was C.S. Lewis's old house. And it was the place where he had written something. I don't know if it was one of the real things. And it was just a great comfort. Things are happening, and I am very uplifted with them.
Comfort in the bird's song.
Hmm.
Yes, in general, the fact that nature seems to take this opportunity, and the animals and other organisms are celebrating.
I love seeing all the beautiful flowers when we go for our walks, as well as the people that we don't know that are always waving hello.
See it in an example of students raising money to buy masks and deliver them to healthcare workers.
I see it in air that's now clear enough that I can smell things like flowers and grass and bark when I'm outside, when I couldn't before.
I love the images of all the bears cavorting in Yosemite Park without all the humans around. It's just wonderful to watch them do that.
Hmm.
I see it in a photograph that showed coyotes. I guess they're I'm not sure what side of the Golden Gate Bridge they were located, but somehow they're there, but we just don't see them because of our daily rush.
My friends, we are surrounded by resurrection. And when things are most seemingly desolate, seemingly barren like the desert, that is often when God's power is most at work, much like the desert being one of the most dynamic ecosystems in the world. And I invite you to have faith, especially in those hard times, that God is there in the midst of it, that God is there in the power of the resurrection, bringing about life. For me, it was when the van was stolen this past week, on Monday, Thursday, actually. It felt horrible. Who would do that? Who would, during Holy Week, steal a van labeled food pantry? Yet, I had to know and had to believe that somehow, in the midst of such a horrible thing, God was able to be at work, that God was going to work in and through it, that God was going to be present. And that's to me what resurrection is. While the disciples were hunkered down, while it was gloomy, while they were afraid, resurrection was there just outside the door. They just had to open their ears, and in seeing that power, they believed. And for us, our belief is knowing that it's there, whether we see it or not. And then our faith becomes an expectant looking for it and opening our eyes to finding it because we know it's there, much like the greenery and the flowers and the creatures in the desert. So I invite you in your darkest times to remember that there is a glimmer, that the stars are there. You might see the mud, but there are also the stars, just a slight tilt of perspective upward. God is able to work infinitely more than we can ask or imagine, and that is a great gift and blessing. And may that be your comfort during this time.